Good morning, everyone. This year we are witnessing the longest war against a people in history. 100 years on, Palestinians are struggling for life and freedom in their country, which is at the moment granted for most people on earth. That simple freedom is denied them for 100 years, and they are still struggling on. On the 9th day of December 1917, barely 1 month after the capture of Beersheba and the infamous Balfour Declaration, General Allenby strode in Jerusalem streets on foot, out of deference to the sanctity of the place. His military intelligence chief, Meiratz Hagen, who credited himself with the ruse to capture Beersheba, was not so diplomatic. He bluntly stated in his memoirs, "We enter on this, the seventh crusade, to once and for all evict all the Muslim Turks from the sacred place of Christianity. The idea of Jerusalem becoming an Arab city revolts me." That day ended 1400 years of Arab and Muslim rule and 4,000 years of Palestinian control and life in their city of Jerusalem, Al-Quds. The players who did it, the colonial powers, whether new or old, are pursuing the same policy today, 100 years on. Now enter Ronald Storrs, the cultured colonial Orientalist, who became the military governor of Jerusalem after Allenby victory. He introduced the Hebrew language for the first time, spoken then on daily basis by a minority of the minority of Jews in Jerusalem, who comprised only 9% of the population. He changed the names of streets and from Islamic heroes to Christian saints of the Crusade period. He issued a public notice that no person shall demolish, erect, alter, or repair the structure of any building in the city of Jerusalem. That was not out of preservation of Jerusalem, but to start an archaeological campaign to verify the veracity of the Bible and the Jewish link to it. He established the Pro-Jerusalem Society with the commendable aim of the protection of and addition to amenities of Jerusalem. Members of the society are religious leaders of Muslim and Christians and Jews. Well, that's fine, of course, but the Jewish member was the president of the Jewish agency which came to colonize Palestine. The cultural colonization of Palestine, that is, to erase Palestine's history and presence, continued. The antiquity law of Palestine, crafted by the Zionist legal secretary Norman Bintwich and promulgated as the first act by the Zionist High Commissioner Herbert Samuel in 1920, has a sinister aim. This aim, it's a curious element in this law. It defined antiquities, and hence the need to protect them, by structures built before 1700. And that excluded 230 structures, schools, seminaries, maqams, charity houses built by the Ottoman Muslims since that year. So the structure worthy of preservation are those close to the Crusader period and before. Well, Herbert Samuel did more than that. He was the first High Commissioner of Palestine, a well-known Zionist. For the first year of his term, which lasted 5 years, he established the foundations of Israel. He issued more than 100 ordinances establishing separate Jewish banks, separate education system, separate ministries, separate labor unions, separate parliament, and to top it all, he established Jewish army, later to be the Haganah. The challenge to the Palestinian nature of Jerusalem came also soon after, in physical terms. In 1929, some Bolshevik Jews who immigrated to Palestine set up permanent structures and banners claiming the western wall of Al-Haram al-Sharif to be the Wailing Wall to be Jewish property. Britain established an international commission of Sweden, Switzerland, and Netherlands, all Christian countries, none of them is Britain, to investigate. The 1930 report of the commission stated that the ownership of the wall, as well as the possession of it and those parts of the surrounding, accrues to the Muslims, and the wall itself, as being an integral part of Al-Haram al-Sharif, was a Muslim property. The Jews can worship there, but leave no permanent structures. But what happens after that? The influx of Jewish European settlers under the mandate led to 1936 revolt. Their numbers have increased, and the Palestinians revolted against that. Britain military brutally quelled the revolt and decimated the Palestinian society completely. So we can consider, quite rightly, 1939, 10 years before Al-Nakba, that was the British-inflicted Nakba on Palestinians. But Ben Gurion was ready, of course, to bounce in Palestine. In May 1942, Biltmore Conference, attended by 600 Zionist leaders, Ben Gurion declared Palestine to be Jewish Commonwealth in 1942. By 1947, Jews became 30% of the population, but they still, under the British collusion, owned no more than 6.5% of the land. So in 1947, this is the Jerusalem boundary during the mandate. This is one of 1,200 divisions, administration of Palestine. Palestine has about 1,200 towns and villages. Each one of them has a village land or city land, and this was the boundary of Palestine, of Jerusalem. At that time, the black area is the old city of Jerusalem. But then the partition plan came. I'm sure you heard a lot about the partition plan. Partition plan suggested 55% of Palestine to the new Jewish immigrants who composed 30%, mostly recent immigrants. Many of them were not Palestinian citizens, and 45% for Palestinians. Let me just remind you of something which you already may not heard about. The partition plan has no binding authority whatsoever. It was only a recommendation. And the recommendation would be accepted if the parties concerned would agree to it. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, there has been 5 or 6 partition plans. It was then accepted after many trials. And that was between 2 indigenous people. In Palestine, the partition was between indigenous people and new settlers. So when the partition plan came, the Israelis found this is a very good opportunity to jump on Palestine. They started to do that. Yes, I'm sorry. This is the boundary of Jerusalem under the partition plan. In the blue line, it contains Jerusalem and many villages around it. So the Israelis wanted to take over Palestine, and they started to do that. This is the situation in March 1948, 4 months after the partition plan. They took the red areas, occupied it, expelled the population in that area, and then something strange for them happened in March 1948. And I'm sure the Zionist propaganda never tell you about that. In the mid-March 1948, the United Nations dropped the partition plan, and the United States agreed to dropping the partition plan because they found, and I quote, they could not be implemented without bloodshed. So the partition plan, which was a suggestion by the UN and the United States, both of them dropped it and instead appointed Count Fort Bernadotte to be the UN mediator in preparation for trusteeship by the United Nations instead of Britain. Now, this came as a thundering bolt to Ben Gurion. So he decided to take over Palestine. And this period, between mid-March and 1948, between mid-March and 14th of May 1948, when the State of Israel was declared, in these 6 weeks, the Israelis occupied 220 villages, 220, and expelled the refugees from these towns and villages who comprise today half the whole population. In other words, half the refugees were expelled by the Haganah before something called Israel was ever established, and before the British left, and before any Arab soldier entered Palestine. So Israel was not in self-defense. It committed the ethnic cleansing even before it was declared. This fact is very rarely mentioned. So what Ben Gurion did, he decided to invade Jerusalem. And the blue area is the so-called Jewish state under the partition plan, and the other area is the Arab state. So he crossed the Jewish state into the Arab state and attacked Jerusalem. By the way, many of you hear the word Jewish state thinking it is a Jewish state and the other one Arab state. It's a misnomer. This is simply because the British terminology at the time called the Jewish settlers as Jews and called the Arab Palestinians as Arabs. The United Nations would never condone establishing a racist or religious state. So when they say religious Jewish state, they don't mean that. They mean the area of Palestine to be governed by the Jewish settlers. And in that area, the Palestinians were 50% of the population. And in the Arab state, there were no Jews. So what I wanted to tell you here, that Israel occupied West Jerusalem illegally even in 1948. Today we talk about 1967, that Israel occupied the eastern part of Jerusalem. But both sides of Jerusalem have been occupied illegally at different dates. When Israel attacked Jerusalem, the red line is the new armistice line. And so the area of Jerusalem has expanded in this manner. They actually annexed Jerusalem, added 72 square kilometers out of the traditional Jerusalem area, and they called it the New Jerusalem. Here is something you have to see. This is called the Harat al-Magharba, or the Moroccan quarter. It is adjacent to Burak Wall, and this is the Aqsa Mosque here. This Moroccan quarter is 800 years old, built by Salah ad-Din for Moroccan pilgrims. 1 week after Israel occupied East Jerusalem, they destroyed it. The yellow area is what it was, the Moroccan quarter. The pink area has been partially destroyed. The other area is not destroyed. The red dots indicate religious sites and mosques which have been destroyed, 800 years old. The brown one on the right is Masjid al-Aqsa. And this was done in 1 week. You see, it became empty. And many of the occupants of the Harat al-Magharba was buried under the rubble. They did not give them time to leave. And so here is what it was, and then here is what it came. And that is where Mr. Pence, the VP, introduced his prayers into the stone of the Wailing Wall in this empty area where people have been expelled from Jerusalem and their 800 years old houses destroyed. So after that, Israel expanded more in the neighboring area, and then they added 172 square kilometers, so total 244 square kilometers added to Jerusalem. And what happens, of course, is that when they built the construction wall or the apartheid wall around it, many of the Palestinian villages have been surrounded. And now you can see how many settlers are introduced in Jerusalem area. This, of course, these are 2010 numbers. Now they are more than that. And there you can see how many settlers they have introduced in Jerusalem area. Now, what happened, of course, to the Palestinians themselves, they have been surrounded, of course. And you can see the red area. These villages in red have been surrounded by the apartheid wall, and they cannot move. And then this one, and this one, and this one. So these become isolated, and they have all the kind of plans to make them refugees again. As you well know, here are the areas Israel took the red areas out of old city of Jerusalem, and then they wanted to expand that into so-called Holy Basin to take over the whole city outside the Jerusalem. I'm sure you are aware we are or living in the time when we see somebody called Trump coming into the picture, reenacting not only Balfour legacy, but much more than that. And he declared Jerusalem to be capital of Israel 100 years after Balfour declared Palestine to be a national home for the Jews. And Trump, as you have heard, will move the U.S. Embassy on Nakba Day to Jerusalem. Therefore, we have here a long trail of colonial legacy and what it brought of dispossession, death, and destruction. Palestinians were 700,000 in 1917. Now there are 13 million, half of them in Palestine soil, and the other half are around it. They will not go away. Palestine remains their homeland. They will overcome, and justice will triumph, I'm sure. Thank you very much.